But never mind. All right, welcome everybody to the Gateway API meeting for the 17th of December 2024. This is our last meeting in 2024, and of course, this is an official event of the CNCF. So please abide by the CNCF Code of Conduct, which boils down to be nice to each other, please. We would really appreciate that. And as I've said before, if you're in a place where you can turn your camera on, that will be great. Uh, the link to the meeting agenda is in the chat. I believe that they have changed chat so that everybody can see that. If you cannot see it, please let me know and I will repaste it. Otherwise, okay, I guess at least one person cannot see it.
Yeah, it all
So
depends on when you join. If you join, including myself, I never saw it because I joined.
there we go. There it is again. It
Sweet.
would be lovely if you can add yourself as an attendee, although it's kind of becoming more clear to me that this seems to be a better slot for a lot of people, but still having the information is great. And if you have anything that you would like to add to the agenda, now is an excellent time to do that. It's an open agenda. Anything you want to talk about is fair game. I also think that I see some folks here that I have never seen before. So if we have new people and you'd like to introduce yourself, now is an excellent time to do that as well. Anybody? Going once?
I can jump in here. I haven't been to
Awesome. Welcome.
before. I'm over at Solo, sort of interested to get a bit deeper into Gateway API. So that's sort of here to listen, and I see some interesting docs for today as well. So yeah, the meeting time for this meeting is also a lot better now, which makes it a lot easier to be part of, which is awesome.
I'm a big fan of the not during dinner time on the East Coast meeting slot myself, personally. Yeah. Welcome. Nice to hear from you. Anybody else?
I've been to a few of these meetings, but I don't think I've gotten an opportunity to introduce myself. My name is Eric. I'm a software engineer at Box, and recently I've been getting involved here, working on the gap for retry budgets with Mike's help and mentorship. So happy to be here, and yeah, looking forward to working on this.
We're happy to have you working on it and welcome. And oh yeah, you and I are definitely going to talk about that one.
Yeah, sounds good.
And
Yeah.
hopefully I'll be a little more active on the mentoring and supporting. I've been juggling a handful of things, so
No
I'm excited to
worries,
see
no
the progress
worries.
you've made so far, though. It's great.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Mike. I can't imagine that you'd be busy towards the end of the year or anything like that. That sounds so unlike you. Yeah. Um, cool. Well, welcome.
Thank you.
Anybody else want to jump in, or shall we continue with the meeting? All right, I guess let's continue with the meeting. Um, and if anybody is curious, the reason that I am the one doing all this is that we thought that none of the actual Gateway API maintainers would be able to make it. So I got suborned into service or something like that. Rob mentioned before we started recording that the thing previously known as the Gateway API LL, I don't even remember the old name anymore, but now it's apparently the Gateway API Inference Extension, which I think sounds better. Is there anything else you wanted to add on that, Rob, or just pointing out that the repo had been renamed if anybody was trying to find the old
No,
repo?
yeah, no, I mean just a reminder for anyone who's interested. This is intending to be an extension that plugs into existing gateway implementations and is useless on its own. But we are trying to make it as easy as reasonably possible to plug into existing gateway implementations and be able to say, hey, I support routing to LLM workloads. And this is meant to be an ecosystem of extensions. So if you support the pattern, then people can plug in whatever extension they like. So it's really meant to be an ecosystem of routing to different forms of LLM workloads, whatever those happen to look like. And there are different optimized ways to do that. So yeah, that's this. Aiming for an O.1 release very early in the new year, and working with a few different implementations to get something out there. But if any other implementations are interested, just let me know. Or there's also community meetings for that. But they're done until the new year. So yeah.
I was about to ask, and when are the community meetings for that, Rob? But never mind, they're irrelevant until 2025. Got it.
So far away.
Yeah. Okay. Next up, we have, by the way, whoever's keeping notes was typing in there. Thank you. I appreciate that. GEPS. Do we actually have any real news on
We
GEPS?
do.
The only particular one that I know of is that Eric started a GEP for retry budgets. Thank you very much. I appreciate that one.
Yeah, if
And
anyone's looking at the agenda, or if you want to share it, present it, whatever, if you go up to the
that would be a
check-ins for every
reasonable
time
idea, wouldn't it?
section, there's actually at least one significant update, which is, well, I can hand it over to percentage based, well, to Lior. We can see your entire screen, which may not be what you're intending.
That's definitely not what I'm intending, and thankfully there's nothing too grim on my screen. There,
Yes,
that should be
this is
better.
probably closer to what you intended.
Yes. All right. And these are the check-ins for every time. So, Lior, I think you were raising your hand there.
After seeing your screen, I lowered it down. Yeah, I mean, I think the gap was in a position where what it needed is mostly conformance tests. Just kind of jumped in. I opened the PR yesterday for conformance test, and that was a very painful one because you have to test the percentage-based request mirroring, which was fine because I was also added the previous request mirroring, so we already had the infrastructure to read the logs. But then I saw someone added, I'm not sure, like in the timeout config, there is a parameter, the last one, which actually says what is the, like, how many requests we should send before we actually confirm the request was successful. And I was never aware of it. And I got, like, I tested it and I got more mirrored requests than the total request I got. And like, I just couldn't figure out why. So it took me like 4 hours to get there. Yeah,
That
but
seems problematic.
yeah, I mean, I think there is the rationale for it is, I get it. Like, you want to, because I used some function to send a request to the gateway, and then, we want to send like 3 requests to make sure the gateway is like ready or whatever. Anyway, it's there. And then I also made some changes to the gap, which I think more important for the scope of the, like, for the scope of the meeting, where I think there's no reason why mesh implementations wouldn't support that as well, because most of meshes do request mirroring. So, also being able to reference to a service is good. And I also going to propose a different supported feature for that, because, that way we could control it differently, like, some gateway APIs and implementations.
That
Like,
sounds
do you
great
wanna-
and very useful. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Do you
Yeah.
want to toss a link to that GEP into the meeting notes?
I think so. This is the check-ins, but if you go down below the names, I just added a link to the PR, which has a link
Excellent.
to the GEP. So yeah, and also other thing which I probably want to encourage for other GEPs, so I might edit a template, is I also added a scope, which the scope is obviously HTTP route, but also gRPC route, because why not? So yeah, that's basically it. And on the same note, if more implementation, so I know Istio and Cilium. I learned yesterday that Cilium also supports it. So if other
Cool.
implementations support it, let us know here in the meeting notes. And yeah, we probably need more implementation.
Yeah, as a reminder to get this to GA, which is the goal, which would make room for another experimental feature, we will need at least 3. So looks like we're 1 away. If anyone wants to volunteer or just mention that you already support it, also great. But looking for 1 more in the not too distant future.
And also, if
Have we
anyone
ever-
here in the call, sorry, would you say something?
No, go ahead.
If anyone here in the call is not a maintainer or any involved in any implementation, but is interested to implement something, I'm also happy to kind of walk through some other implementations that I'm familiar with and help on making a contribution.
Yeah, although this one is awful to conformance test, it seems relatively easy to implement coming from someone who hasn't actually implemented it themselves. So I don't know. But on the surface, you know.
Oh, it's easy, yeah. It's just like, you know, touching some.
Trivial.
Yeah.
What I was going to ask a second ago was not to open a huge can of worms, but have we thought at all about whether it should be 3 implementations of, you know, the Ingress side versus 3 implementations of the mesh side for any of these features? I don't
You know,
think that we really have. I don't think it really, I don't think it's a big deal for this one, and I'm having a hard time thinking of situations where it would be a thing. It just occurred to me to wonder.
well, it's interesting because Lior mentioned that he was planning on splitting this into separate supported features, which
Mhm.
I think makes sense. But it also makes me wonder if those supported features should or could graduate at different times, depending on how many implementations are passing the tests
That's
underneath them.
Yeah, it's kind of it's interesting to think about, especially because it raises questions like, oh, so does that mean this is really taking up 2 slots in experimental? Um,
Is
well,
it though?
there's also the context of like, yeah, guess I guess we have 3 active mesh implementations between Linkerd, Cilium, and Istio, but that's
yeah.
you're basically waiting for all of them rather than 3 out of 20 something active
Yeah, which is,
implementations.
like I said, it's a can of worms I didn't necessarily want to open right this second. You know, we should probably toss a note of, oh yeah, we should discuss this at some point, but that point might not be right this second. We can
Is
think
it
about
though
it and bring
like
it back.
can we think of situations where, you know, an implementation can support it for north south but cannot support it for mesh? I feel like it's gonna
Sure.
be
Yes,
Yeah,
that definitely
there
happens in Istio.
that happens all the time.
well,
Yeah.
no, but for this specific feature I'm saying.
I mean, it could have just gotten forgotten to, you know, like you could implement it one way and forget. Yeah,
Yeah,
I don't know.
it's
Yeah.
mostly like it might be 2 different PRs and like somebody
Yeah.
is
Yeah,
slower
but I mean,
merging one or something.
for the
Yeah.
purpose of, like what I'm saying, sorry, let me rephrase that. What I'm saying, for the purpose of meaningfully have 3 supported like 3 implementations. So like when I think of this feature, it's eventually it's just, you know, attaching some envoy config, like route config, like, and I'm trying to think meaningfully if there could be a way. For example, I'm thinking on this feature, there might be other features that it is meaningful. It could be a way that, like, okay, an implementation can meaningfully, like, can implement that, but have a very different angle for mesh for this feature, so they wouldn't be able to implement that.
I think that you're right that for this one it is pretty similar and straightforward for mesh and north-south. I don't think that there's a ton of difference there. For something like, I think retries is a great example of something which is
Yeah.
potentially implemented very differently in mesh and in north-south because of where that logic is being applied and where the configuration is being read from.
Even with even with a feature that's likely to be implemented similarly between north, south, and east, west, then you still could end up with different people, different PRs, things like that. But I would like to time box this discussion right now because we're all kind of thinking and talking on the fly rather than coming in with some considered opinions. But Rob, what were you gonna say?
Yeah, I'll just hopefully finish this out with one of the things I've been thinking about more recently is the stability of conformance tests and tracking that. And I think we
Mm.
recently added the idea of like a preliminary conformance test, and it does not go straight to GA or
Required.
stable, required, whatever, until you have several passing implementations. So maybe we have enough signal if we say, okay, 3 implementations are passing conformance for the core part of this feature. But then if we, whenever we add mesh tests, the like mesh supported feature and corresponding conformance tests stay as preliminary until we have, I don't know, a majority of mesh implementations supporting it or some such thing, or passing it.
Yet another stage for graduating conformance test.
Yeah, no.
Next step is having conformance test to the conformance tests.
Not gonna lie, there's some concern that comes up as I think about this along those lines. Right?
Yeah, all I was gonna say is I think the biggest risk here is that we get something wrong in our like mesh conformance test because no mesh supports it on day 0. Then we launch,
Right.
and then we have to make a breaking change. But then someone else like adjusted their mesh to support the, it just is a mess. So
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, yeah, good thing to bring up again next year after we've all gotten to think about it, or who am I kidding, after we haven't thought about it at all during the holiday season, but we can try, right?
Yeah.
All right. So that was an odd bit of bouncing around as people updated the agenda there. Was there anything else to add about percentage-based mirroring, or shall we hop
Yeah,
over to
please
back in
review the
TLS
PR.
policy?
Yeah.
Excellent. There's a PR there. People can go look at it. Great. I believe Candace is here. Candace, I saw somebody typing about back into TLS policy. You have comments on that?
Yes, and that was me who moved the Lior's conversation up to the top.
Thank you.
Just because we're going through
Because
the
we were doing it.
conformance, yeah, going through the gaps. So yes, still help wanted with conformance tests. I think in the end we are just doing 3. The first one, a normative test, is this one. Still work in progress. That's on me. I'm having some issues with connections, and I haven't looked at it for some time, so I'm going to try to get that done by the end of the year. I may reach out to some of you for assistance. But if you want to take a look at and review the PR, that's great. If you want to pick up one of the conformance tests, there was one person who was working on them, Pranshu Srivastava. I don't know if that person is here today. No, I don't think so.
It doesn't look like it.
That was in late November. We had a Slack conversation about it. But there's another conformance test needed. And we have 5 implementations, so we're doing pretty well.
Sorry,
That's
I
it.
now have this moment of, oh Lord, we're going to do the conformance test and then find out that 4 of the 5 don't pass the conformance test. And will that mean that there's a problem in the test or in the implementations? Yeah,
In the
that would be
test,
fun.
most likely.
You never know. Which is, of course, why it's important to have the conformance tests before going to GA. So if anybody is interested in helping out with that, that would be great, actually. Okay, I don't believe Guy is on at the moment. Does anybody else know anything up with policy attachment gaps other than what a nightmare?
I can give you an update.
Hi.
Hi, Thomas here. I'm a bit out of breath because I'm walking my dogs. Because this is that time just before it gets dark. Otherwise, I'll be a bad dog owner.
That sounds familiar.
So yeah, Guy just became the father of a beautiful daughter. So he's out for a little
Oh,
bit.
congrats.
Yeah, so I'm happy for him, but so far she is not, I think, very compatible with direct or indirect policies.
I'm sure she is dictating. I'm sure she is attaching many policies to both Guy and her other parent.
Yes, definitely. So yeah, basically that's all I have here right now, to be continued.
Okay. Thanks for the update. And if you run across, if you are still in touch with Guy and he's, awake enough to hear such things, please convey our congratulations. That's excellent news, actually.
Thank you.
Be happy if you tell him more about policy attachment than congratulations.
I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that he's probably not thinking a lot about policy attachment with a newborn. I don't know. I don't know if it's his first, but wow.
Yeah, it's his first, so yeah, I
Oh
think so.
yeah, he will definitely not be thinking about policy attachment then. Oh my God. Cool. Okay.
Can I just ask one question, Flynn?
Yeah.
Is anyone else working with Guy on policy attachment?
Candidly, I'm going to have to go look that up. I know that there are people who are interested. I also know that the general consensus when Guy volunteered to lead the standardization effort on that was, oh dear Lord, Guy is insane, also very brave, and we're happy that he's doing it. So I don't think that there was somebody else who was dying to jump on that particular grenade. Rob, do you know
Yeah,
differently
no,
there?
I think that's pretty accurate. I know Nick was hoping to help, but I don't know that he had the capacity to lead that effort.
I would
And
expect
I'll
not, given the auth
yeah.
stuff.
I was similarly planning to review anything that Guy comes up with because I've read a lot of the prior work that he's done, but I absolutely do not have bandwidth to lead it.
Yeah.
Same here.
I mean,
Yeah,
I
and the
think many of us are in.
same is true
Go
for
ahead.
some people in the quadrant teams, some engineers also having worked with Guy on it, but not necessarily leading. So
Yeah.
I think that's going to be hard.
And let's be clear, if that ends up not becoming standard in 1.3, then it ends up not becoming standard in 1.3, and we'll work around that, right? So, speaking in my unofficial capacity as not being a Gateway API maintainer, there's process to deal with this, and that would be fine. Although, obviously, if we do end up finding somebody who can continue to lead that, then that would also be fine, right? It is a nasty topic. I would really, really hate to try to force somebody to try to lead that unless they really feel up to it. So, yeah, Guy might be it on this particular topic for this particular time. Yeah. And I think that Guy should absolutely not be thinking about this particular topic at this particular time. So, all right, that's it for the things that we're hoping to standardize. We had a meeting that Rob or I will summarize later about HTTP connection coalescing and listener isolation, and that gets into listener sets and things like that. I don't believe that Liang is on this call right now. So I believe I saw Dave on. Dave, do you want to talk about where you want to talk up the news with listener sets, if there is any news with listener sets?
Yeah, I think I saw some comments from Rob and Nick. I'm probably just gonna do a pass over the GEP maybe this week.
Cool.
What are the timelines again? Is it like
It needs to be done tomorrow, and
yeah, it's by the end of the year, or else we aim for January 20. I want to say is the
that
date.
sounds
It's somewhere
about right.
down there.
yeah, that should
Yeah,
be good. I'll
but
just
yeah, no,
cancel all
this is a
my
big
kids' Christmas pageant tonight.
Oh, cool.
January
Robin
21st.
Flynn said I gotta do it.
That's right.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, we should just
I'm sure your
constantly have that in the agenda. Thanks.
I'm sure your kids would totally understand that, right?
Yeah. But yeah, that's it. I think the comments are pretty straightforward to address. And I think
Cool.
after that, then the follow-up would be to just land the API, the Go changes.
Okay. Any I don't know, anything in particular fascinating about the changes or anything that you would like to make certain that people are thinking about?
I'll be biased here and say I think this is a huge change. And I would encourage everyone to take a look. I'm viewing listener sets as kind of our opportunity to revisit anything we may have regretted about the way Gateway was structured, or more fundamental.
No pressure.
Yeah, no pressure, right? So you know, there's a big doc that went along with this that basically tried to highlight all the cross-cutting things that this covers, and it was anything from L4 routing to gateway merging to TLS config to like there's there's so many different variations that this could address. So just because you say, oh, this is for merging gateways, it must not be relevant to this one thing I really care about. There's probably a good chance it intersects with it. So just I recommend taking a look, thinking a bit, from a higher level picture of could this possibly, overlap with this feature I really care about? And if it does, then think about it from that perspective.
Cool.
So yeah, no pressure. Great.
Yeah.
I'm gonna send the recording to my kids, so when they ask, "Are you sure Rob cares?" And I'm like, "Yes, he does."
Great. Yeah. This is the sort of point where those of us with kids go. All right. Retry budgets. I know that Mike and Eric are both on the call. I will confess that I looked at this GEP when I saw it come over the transom just long enough to go, oh, hey, it's a GEP. This looks cool. Leora, were you raising your hand because you wanted to get back to listener sets or because you had something to say about retry budgets or?
Retries.
Okay.
Should I
well,
go now or you wanted to finish it? Whatever you have.
Yeah, go ahead. Take it away.
I just wanted to ask a question for Mike. And Mike and Eric probably. Mike, you just mentioned that retry is going to have a different story for mesh, which makes sense. I just wanted to know, following our previous meeting, whether the gap also addresses the mesh, use cases, and if not, if there is any iterative plans to address them and when.
There probably should be iterative plans to amend the existing retry gap, not the one that Eric's working on, but I know that Eric is like dealing with the issues of how to implement this for mesh for focusing on the retry budgets case. It basically, the TLDR of what this comes down to is that for a north-south implementation, it's pretty straightforward of you have configuration in your gateway and your gateway is retrying to the backends. For a mesh implementation, you start to get into the like producer versus consumer configuration, and are you defining my service should retry 3 times when connecting to this other service, or are you as a service producer saying services connecting to me should retry up to 3 times? And how to get into programming the data plane to do that is also fun. Particularly when you get into like more complex things like ambient versus like a traditional sidecar model.
It's kind of,
I'll leave it there.
I feel like that's less an issue of programming the data plane and more an issue of defining the semantics that we're talking about.
Maybe,
yes.
maybe throwing like just random idea in my head. Isn't it reminding a little bit of MTLS, where you need to define whether the destination should enforce MTLS and whether the client should issue MTLS in a world where there is no auto MTLS, like client and basically server? Because my understanding,
if we take MTLS out of that and say TLS configuration instead, I think it gets closer.
Yeah,
but
no, actually no. Like, I'm bringing it up to make sure I'm understanding correctly. So what I understand from Mike is like, we're trying to understand whether the semantics would be, okay, I'm a server, so I want clients connecting to me to retry 3 times, or I'm a client, I want to retry 3 times when I'm connected to the server. So is that a fair capture?
Yes, with the caveat that like also the client side configuration may be more likely to be easier to implement in sidecar based meshes. I need to look at the details of whether we would support the consumer policy in Z tunnel for Istio ambient.
In Linkerd, this actually gets to be fairly interesting because things like, I'm going to pick on timeouts for a moment. They are implemented by the outgoing sidecar, but they have to be able to see
Exactly.
policy. They have to be able to see policy at both ends.
Exactly. Yeah.
Rob, you've had your hand up for a little bit.
Yeah, so I am not the mesh expert in the room, to be clear, but the thing that that gives me some pause here is the idea that, at least my understanding of this gap from looking at it briefly, is that it's adding the config to HTTP route, but it seems like we're saying that actually meshes aren't going to implement that config, which generally since mesh for gateway has become a thing, almost everything we added to routes.
Wait. Why would we be saying mesh wouldn't implement? Or
Okay, maybe I'm misunderstanding.
Sorry. I was talking about the original retries that already exist in HTTP route. Eric's gap is focused on retry budgets, and I will kind of let's go address Candace's question first. After that, maybe I'll hand it over to Eric, who I think has already done some great exploration of policy attachment versus HTTP route and kind of the implications for the decisions to be made here.
to be clear, I consider it fairly likely that we might see north-south and east-west obtain support at different times. But yeah, I didn't think we were talking about anything where HTTP route would suddenly not be the way you configure HTTP routing east-west. So that was fascinating to hear for a second. Candace, go ahead.
I hadn't looked at this at all, and just took a quick look at the GEP and noticed in the TLDR that it's talking about rate limiting, or at least it says limit the rate of. I feel like if we characterized this gap as a step in the direction of implementing rate limiting, if we think that's what it is, that it would get a little bit more interest.
That's interesting. I hadn't really
Yeah.
considered that, but I can see how it could go in that direction. That's a really interesting point to bring up. Thank you.
So I can, unless I'm wrong about that, it just says limit the rate of. That's not necessarily the intention of rate limiting, but
that might have been a mistake of my wording there. So sorry for any confusion on that side. And I guess I will add, what I've worked on so far with this gap, I think I've really only been thinking about the mesh context, since that's kind of like what my background experience is. So maybe just keep that in mind too. And I would definitely appreciate any thoughts on what I have here as far as like the context I laid out, and especially the goals, and whether or not this ends up as a configuration for HTTP route. I actually did add a comment today on the PR, kind of comparing adding this in as something for HTTP route or through a policy attachment. So I'd be interested if anyone has thoughts on what I put there as well.
My immediate thought is that you didn't capitalize Linkerd here. So
No,
gonna reject the whole.
I'll correct myself from now on. Thank you.
that one. I see Linkerd proxy. That's correct. That's lowercase.
So I think when Guy gets back, he may be able to talk to you about policy and rate limiting, because I think that's what he and Thomas, or Thomas is, I think he works on that at Red Hat with Quadrant, Quadrant being the open source version.
I think that, and Eric, please correct me if you think I'm putting words in your mouth and getting it wrong. The fascinating thing about retries is that if you enable retries and you don't also come up with a way to decide to stop retrying, then really, really bad things happen. With counted retries, the way you stop is you do a maximum number of retries and then you stop. With budgeted retries, you allow the retries to continue as long as the percentage of retries hasn't gone over a particular number with respect to all the traffic. So when we talk about limiting the rate of retries here, I that to me has more to do with determining when you're going to stop retrying as opposed to slowing down requests so that you don't overwhelm your target service. And that slowing down requests so that you don't overwhelm a workload is more of what I think rate limiting is about. What I think is really interesting here, though, is that some of the implementations, and I'm looking at Envoy, kind of lump budgeted retries in with circuit breaking, which is kind of lumped in with rate limiting. So things get a little weird under the hood. But I think we want to be very careful about trying to keep those semantics separate. Mike, Eric, do y'all agree with
Uh,
that?
Yeah, what I found, I mean, I have more experience with Istio, but what I found with Linkerd is I feel like, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, but I feel like the functionality of retry budgets is pretty similar, right? You're just
It happens
you're
to be, yeah.
yeah, it's just kind of where in their APIs that's configured is a bit different.
Right.
But yeah, for that reason, I was kind of leaning more towards doing this with policy attachment. But also, I've been trying to kind of wrap my head around the whole policy attachment thing. But yeah, I think it would just be a difficult thing to actually add into HTTP route because um, then I think like any HTTP route object that's pointing to the same service, they would have to conform somehow. Since yeah, the budget won't be per route; it's going to be for the service itself, if that makes sense. But
So we should probably talk about that a little bit. It won't
Could I
surprise
just,
anybody. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, Eric, that I like the idea of it being a step in the right direction for rate limiting to some extent. I don't agree that rate limiting necessarily has to be ratcheting or slowing down of the number of connections. I mean, a rudimentary way could be, just ending the connections. Or ending the new connections from happening based on counting. Just a rudimentary way. It's just it's iteratively approaching what we might need for rate limiting to some extent without doing all of it at the same time. So I like the idea that it could be a step in the direction of rate limiting and would not encourage you to remove that from from the proposal. I'd rather see it highlighted as some part of it because just the term retry budgets, I think, sort of minimizes what you're doing there, and it could be highlighted and gain a little bit more support. Just my 2 cents on that. Thank you.
Lior.
Yeah, I think just a quick one. I think as a community we have to kind of evaluate the attaching things like things that feels like policy to HP routes as a whole. We have this discussion often, like also Nick gap for often we're going to have the same discussion there. And I think we should kind of try to look at it from a broader perspective because it can feel, without getting too deep in my opinion, but it can be very confusing that, like, okay, for some things we're going to go there, or something we're going to go there. I obviously understand
Yeah.
the constraints with policy attachment, and that's why I'm excited to see what Guy gonna come up with. But yeah, it's just like feels that sometimes we need to consider, but we want to overuse HP routes versus policies. And if policies are not the right way to do it because it's complex, so we should work to make sure it's not complex, not just stack policies in different ways. So yeah, I know it's a big topic right now, but like just like
Yeah.
it all comes down to like we should not evaluating per HTTP route or per policy per gap. I think we should have a broader discussion on it.
What I was going to say earlier about that was that, yeah, Mike and Eric, I would like to talk a little bit more about that. It won't surprise anybody on this call when I say that I would prefer not to use policy attachment for this, but it gets into some interesting questions about, where do you put this if you don't put it in a route? And that's this, unfortunately, service is the kind of natural place to put it in a lot of ways. Um, and there's a discussion to be had there for sure, because that really does get into some fascinating stuff around policy, like you're saying there.
You can go implement Tim Hawkins' idea of service extensions, and good luck with that plan.
Are you truly trying to tell me that you think it would be worse than policy attachment? Because I don't think you are.
No, I think it would be better. I think it's just a tremendous amount of work that'll take 3 to 5 years.
Well, I mean, guess we better get started, right? Thomas, you were going to say, or either I
Yeah.
think you were next up.
Yeah, thanks. I'll definitely point some other people to this draft proposal to have a look at
Excellent.
it and maybe leave their ideas there. And yes, I also agree with Ken is that like rate limiting can mean very simply that you have a limit, and then after that, once you hit the limit, you don't get any requests through, right? Or that would be maybe well, and then there's also the case of authenticated rate limiting, right, which is more like kind of a business level rate limiting, etc. But yes, we'll have a look. Thank you.
I'd like to point out that if you are doing retries and you hit your maximum number of retries, that is very, very different in what gets returned and in what it means than you are going too fast. One of these is going to get some variety of 500 error, and the other is going to get a 429. And those are really, really different scenarios, which is part of why I'm pushing back a bit on trying to link retry budgets and rate limiting too much. It's still an interesting thing to look at in the nature of the implementations, but there are some really different semantics that we have to be careful about. I guess, Rob, you had your hand up too?
Yeah, it's been a while, so I'm trying to remember all the great insightful comments I was going to make. With that said, I do agree with what others have said, that I view policy attachment as the place we go if we really have no other option. It is a solution of least resort, not our primary solution. I would rather build native built-in APIs wherever we can. I am excited about. I've seen some renewed interest in making L4 and cluster IP gateways reality, and I've been chatting with someone actually internally who's trying to work on what that might look like, and so that gives me some hope that maybe we can help solve some of these things. Like maybe if we had
Cluster IP
cluster
gateway
IP
feels like
gateway.
it shouldn't be that hard even.
Yeah, famous last words. But
well, so part of the reason
yeah.
I say that is that there is a way to configure Envoy Gateway to do exactly that. So we have some
Yeah.
prior art there.
Yeah,
And
no, what I'm really hoping for is, so that's one aspect of it, but what I'm really meaning is cluster IP gateways as a drop-in replacement for cluster IP services, like a universal built into Kubernetes kind of experience. So we'll see, but one of the things that could come out of that is related to some of the work I've been involved in inference gateway extension, whatever. One of the things that's happening there is, or gateway API inference extension. No, it's a mouthful, but whatever. In that project, we are adding a new backend for gateway API, and that new backend type can include more things instead of augmenting it with policy. And I view this as a great big experiment for maybe we should have a new backend instead of service for gateway that can basically mean all the backend policies we have are not necessary. Just spitballing there. It'll take a minute to get there, but that's a vision that seems, because there's a lot of things in service that are irrelevant and confusing, especially if you're talking about cluster IP gateways and you say, I can have a cluster IP service, or I could, and I can have a gateway that points to it. It gets very confusing. So trying to separate those is compelling to me. Anyways, but that's all I wanted to. Well, actually, no. One last thing I want to mention, and then I'll give up on my whirlwind tour here. Is I've been really thinking about Mesh more, and this discussion about Mesh and how it interacts with a few things, supported features for Lior's GEP, the retry and retry budgets as well, has got me thinking. It would be good. I think we've already been talking about this to just have a Mesh focused, maybe one-off meeting about what we're doing, what the future is, maybe with Mesh leads, maybe early in the new year, and for anyone who's interested, but ideally at minimum getting Mesh leads together and anyone who's hoping to push Mesh forward. Yeah, anyways, I feel like we've already talked about that. I can't quite remember, but if not, I would love to do something in the early new year on that front.
I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, I think so as well. Yeah, I think we talked about it last time. So yeah, we just need to make sure like all the people that want to be there can be there in the date that we're choosing. And
Yep.
Yeah.
Maybe someone can throw out some random dates the week of like January 6 or 7 or sometime in that ballpark when hopefully people are starting to show back up to work, maybe. But yeah, okay.
Rob, I was going to point out that idea of adding a new kind of backend is something that we've kicked around a bit within Linkerd as well, because there are ways that you just can't get certain semantics with using services as backends as they are currently defined. And if you try to redefine the semantics, you make things worse in a lot of ways. So we've also kind of been coming to the conclusion that in some situations, probably the only reasonable thing to do is to define a thing that's not of service at all. And then you gain a lot of interesting capabilities.
Yes.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, we can talk about that sometime offline. We have 7 minutes left. This has not been a short meeting as I expected it might be. I am going to point out that Nick and Jan Gao did do an initial draft of the auth terminology definitions discussion GEP. That's linked there under auth. I would strongly recommend people take a look at that. It mostly seems to me to be pretty non-controversial and, just a useful starting point, but I would still encourage everybody to look at it. Danyan, you had your hand raised. Was that something quick? And then we can let Rob quickly talk about this meeting we had yesterday.
Yeah, it is. I was actually typing it in the chat window, but I was just curious with Rob's point about potentially defining a new backend type. Does a GitHub issue exist currently or a GitHub conversation? Maybe we start off with a GitHub conversation to continue the dialogue and eventually transition it to a GitHub issue. Do you think that makes sense?
I think this is, yeah, no, definitely. I was trying to avoid things getting lost in, as everyone disappears and then it becomes stale by the time people reappear in January kind of thing. But I know there's, at least a doc or GEP or something coming to talk about the broader idea of cluster IP gateways. And I'm hoping that will include some proposal or ideas of how we could have a custom backend type. And that the person I've been talking with, actually, she was at a earlier Gateway meeting and talked about this at a high level, is planning to come back early January and present in more detail. So
Cool. Okay.
Neat. That sounds really interesting. Looking forward to hearing more.
There's a lot of ways that the cluster IP gateway idea makes sense to me. There have been a couple of talks where I was pointing out that even if your gateway doesn't live on the edge of a cluster, then there are some interesting semantics that still end up making sense. And
Yep.
yeah, so I don't feel like it always makes sense to use a cluster IP gateway instead of a service. Let's be clear about that. But there are situations where I think it probably does make a fair amount of sense. And that brings us up to the conversation we had about connection coalescing and listener isolation, which pretty much boils down to, here are a bunch of bad ideas. Which one do we think is least bad?
Yeah, I really appreciate everyone who was able to show up to this meeting. This is the thing that I'd been posting about in Slack for a while, trying to find a time that worked. It was an awful time if you were in Europe, and it was an awful time if you were in Australia, but somehow we managed to get people from both Europe and Australia to show up to the call. So thank you to everyone who did show up. The end of the doc, I think Candace may have, I think it was Candace, captured some of the outcomes of it. It's we really struggled in that this is, as Flynn said, not an obvious solution anywhere. But the baseline is when we see overlapping host names configured on a gateway on different listeners, we should warn and have some kind of standardized documentation that we can point to and say, hey, listen, you could be putting yourselves in a situation where you end up with more 421s, with more whatever. The client cert validation that is currently per listener is unlikely to be safe there. So we're suggesting that that should move up one level to be gateway wide, or in something like that is higher level anyway. There's some more nuance about exactly where that needs to move, but within a listener is unlikely to be safe anyways. And then we should likely actually go ahead and respond with 421s when we do see mismatches, even though 421s have their own issues, which are well documented in this doc. And then if
Although
we do have gateway level,
it was nice to
TLS
hear that some of the 421 things seem to have been fixed recently. So
yeah, like the biggest problem that everyone kept on mentioning is Safari for a long period of time did not handle 421s, or did not retry on account of them. And so customer users would just get 400 error messages and be confused as to why, right? You can look up 421 in Safari and you'll see all kinds of fun stuff. Apparently that's been fixed, so that's great. Knock on wood. And actually, apparently we have one of former Gateway maintainers to thank for helping get that one fixed. So that's also great.
yeah.
And then the final thing is, if we do add some kind of top level TLS config to Gateway, which seems likely, then it would be exclusive with the TLS config on listeners. So you could either set TLS config for your entire gateway or for individual listeners, but not both. But that's where we landed. This is, again, high level takeaways that will turn into more detailed proposals. But I think we essentially have a problem, and this is trying to be a solution to that. Yeah, I'll leave it there. There's a lot there. If anyone has questions, feel free to raise them or ping on Slack as well, whatever works.
And as you can see, just from looking over this, there is a fair amount of detail in this doc about why this is an ugly problem and things like that. The other thing I would point out on this one is if anyone knows of specific instances where specific clients still have a problem with 421 responses, that would be really nice to hear about. Because that we're pretty sure that 421s are the best we can do in many of these scenarios. It would be lovely to know a little bit more about what sorts of pain we expect to cause by doing that. So, and we're at time. If there's anything else that anybody wants to throw out in the next few seconds, then now's your chance. And if not, then that sounds like we should call it a meeting and go on with our respective days. Anybody? Going once? Going twice? Okay, thanks everybody for showing up. Much appreciated.
Thanks.
We will see y'all in January, although I confess I don't remember exactly what date in January yet. I'm sure it's on the calendar.
Yeah.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Enjoy.
Happy New Year,
Happy
all.
holidays.
Bye.